they can? Okay. Sorry about that. Anyway, I was just mentioning that one of our sadly deceased colleagues, Professor Eamon O'Carrigan, who gave a wonderful lecture back in 2013, Dante and Rome, Ideals and Realities. And not only did he deliver, to my mind, one of the standout lectures of our series, he also made sure that he was present at all other lectures and asking very probing questions. And he did this until his health no longer permitted him to do so. But Eamon, perhaps because he belonged to that older generation of scholars, understood what an intellectual community was about, and his generosity of intellect, I think, was second to none. He's already deeply missed here, but in the context of our Dante lecture series, I just wanted to briefly mention him, and may he rest in peace. Now, before we begin, I want to thank a couple of bodies, the CASELAC, first of all, and I'm delighted to say we have the new director of CASELAC in the room. Greetings to you, Oliver. CASELAC is the Centre for Advanced Studies in Languages and Culture, and they were very generous with their financial support, as was the Society for Italian Studies and indeed our own Department of Italian. I especially want to thank all the members of the Dante Centre here who do a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes, and also to Leonor de Oliveira, who coordinates so many aspects of what we do. So without further ado, I want to welcome our first guest speaker for the series, and this is Professor Stephen Milner. Stephen is the Serena Professor of Italian at the University of Manchester, and he's been in that role since 2006. Between 2017 and 2021, he was the director of the British School in Rome, the UK's largest British international research institute and fine arts academy. His specialisms include late medieval and Renaissance cultural history, reception of classical rhetorical theory in Italy 1250 to 1500, Machiavelli, and which he produced a wonderful edition of the Principe, Boccaccio, Florence and the Medici, Pistoia, and the Florentine territorial state, manuscript and early print book production and parchment, reception of Italian Renaissance in 19th century Northern England, very specific that, and urban space and architecture. So as you can see, he's a man of many, many different sides and interests. Amongst his numerous publications, which are too numerous to list out here, I just want to mention the Cambridge Companion to Boccaccio, The Erotics of Consolation, Distance and Desire in the Middle Ages from 2008, At the Margins, Minority Groups in Pre-Modern Italy, again that's 2005, Artistic Exchange and Cultural Translation in the Italian Renaissance City. And I mentioned just there Niccolo Machiavelli's Principe, the wonderful edition of that. And there's a wonderful, you can see it, there's a program with Alan Yento celebrating Machiavelli. Steve played a very major part of that documentary after discovering the arrest warrant for Machiavelli in the archives in Florence. That's enough for me, just to let you know that the title of his lecture this evening to us is Dante and Political Economy in the Industrial Age. Steve, te la parola. Okay, let me just bring up your... This is very slow, the mouse doesn't work properly. Taking it over to the side. Get there eventually. Grazie.
Okay, thank you very much, Dara, for the very kind invitation. Thank you to the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland. Thank you for being here and giving up your time, those literally embodied and those spirits who are with us virtually. Yeah, I want to start the lecture, and this is partly a gift to Dara, with a photograph of Old Trafford, the world's first industrial estate. Coming from Manchester, obviously, talking about industry, but also seeking to interrogate something about the terms and the reasons why Dante found himself so widespread and so central and so visible within the shock city of modernity. The Central Piazza, Albert Square, named after the Prince Consort, Prince Albert, has just been finished, its kind of restoration. And literally in the centre of the city where the Albert Memorial stands, which was constructed on designs by Thomas Worthington after his grand tour of Italy, and the drawings he took there are 3 medallions on that, one of which is Michelangelo, Tasso, and Dante. So Dante has just been restored, literally, to the centre of the central piazza of Manchester as a town. So, Dante and political economy in the industrial age. Since the publication of a miscellany of texts in the 1989 edited volume Dante, The Critical Heritage, a steady stream of monographs, edited collections, conference proceedings and articles have been published focusing upon the emergence of a cult of Dante in the Anglo-Saxon critical world in the 19th century. Foremost amongst these stands Alison Milbank's erudite and brilliantly argued Dante and the Victorians from 1998, which she began whilst a fellow at the John Rylance Research Institute in Manchester, and more recently known to many of the parish, Federica's Dante Beyond Influence, which was also researched as part of a PhD initially in the shadow of the Rylance. The large majority of these contributions take the form of what I term Dante and, or Dante plus studies, in terms of their critical focus and emphasis. Hence, much has been written on Dante and the Romantics, Dante and the Pre-Raphaelites, Dante and Ruskin, Dante and Gladstone. Yet a survey of the indices of the relevant volumes has yet to find the term political economy listed amongst the subject headings. And to date, I haven't found it in any of the plethora of Dante dictionaries, encyclopedias, companions, and most recently handbooks. This evening, I want to propose, and in part illustrate, why I think political economy is potentially the most revealing critical prism through which to view and make sense of the multiple deployments of Dante in the long 19th century. For all of the movements and the individuals just mentioned were themselves, in some shape or form, fashioned by their engagement with the new social science which gathered such momentum in the aftermath of the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776. For in its early years, political economy was a public concern rather than an academic discipline, and sat at the intersection of debates animating religion, law, politics, and natural philosophy. First and second wave Romanticism, the anti-establishment pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, Ruskin's neo-medievalism and nostalgia for guild-based manufacture, Gladstone's free market liberalism, all were the result of taking positions relative to the seismic socio-political changes consequent on industrialisation, and that political economy sought to both interpret and, in some senses, manage. Two of the greatest texts of the century, Ruskin's 1857 Political Economy of Art, which significantly was actually given as the introductory lectures to the Manchester Fine Arts exhibition of 1857, but that's another paper. And Marx's 1867 Das Kapital, subtitled A Critique of Political Economy, placed the discipline at the heart of their analysis, and both, in different but revealing ways, mobilised Dante in their respective polemics. To my eye, it is clearly more than coincidence that the emergence of the cult of Dante in Britain, Germany, and America was coterminous with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the age of the machines. So the question arises, what was it about the onset of modernity that provided such a fertile reception context for the angry, late medieval Florentine exile poet? What was it about Dante that appealed to those engaging with the new discipline of political economy that sought to address and make sense of the profound socio-economic changes within modernising nation states, or even, in the case of Italy, nation states seeking to be born? To anticipate my conclusion, the answer is relatively straightforward, but bear with me. Dante's works resonated with the radicals, the reformers, and the dissenters who emerged in reaction to the disruptive impact of industrialisation on the social institutions of the Ancien regime, and the privileges of what we can term with a capital E, the establishment. For Dante's ghost was conjured up at a time when the established order was thrown into question. New social imaginaries were being articulated in multiple media, and fundamental shifts were taking place in the distribution of wealth and also the distribution of population. Dante's poetry and worldview spoke as easily to contemporary visions of earthly social and political reform as it did to prophetic, millenarian and spiritualist visions of a social life after death, at a time when a plethora of competing manifestos of political, social and religious reform were printed and preached in an increasingly unstable public sphere. In this context, the widespread use of the title The Vision to refer to Dante's Divine Comedy indicates the extent to which his works resonated with the multiple radical and reformist discourses which sought to imagine and embody new forms of socio-political ordering. So it's Dante the radical, Dante the reformer, Dante the dissident. So my emphasis, therefore, is less Dante and more Dante in, looking into the discerning choices made by writers, artists and organisations when mobilising Dante in their cause. The economy of Dante, in the widest sense, of the conditions of his production, circulation and consumption as resource within prevailing and emerging discourses, whether economic, social, moral, religious or cultural. In short, Dante understood as capital. Viewed in these terms, it's telling to mark the company in which he circulated. With whom does Dante sit in the pantheon of exemplary historical and literary figures that people the narratives and manifestos of radicals, reformers and dissenters? What were the conditions of his adoption? Continuing this contextual approach to Dante in, it's also worth considering Dante's place within the larger cultural translation of late medieval Italy into the 19th century industrial imaginary. How he was mobilised as part of a broader neo-medievalism which drew variously on the experience and example of the medieval Italian city-states from an economic and political as well as artistic and cultural perspective. For the translation of Dante was not just a linguistic phenomenon or stylistic exercise in imitation and intertextual referencing, vital though these were in terms of his reception. His translation from late medieval Italy needs to be read in the context of a broader translation of the cultural capital of the late medieval mercantile communes of Italy to the industrialising centres of the Anglo-Saxon world. This involves considering the material importation of Dante as cultural capital from Italy and his exchange value within the 19th century marketplace for manuscripts, editions, artefacts, icons, etc. The Dante business, if you like, the business of Dante. For the reanimated ghost of Dante haunts not just texts, but lecture halls, libraries, exhibitions, galleries, civic buildings, and as I started out by pointing out, monuments. In what follows, I want to trace and make sense of just a few of these moments and manifestations as Dante was summoned forth by poets, painters, printmakers, publishers, philanthropists, and politicians, other things beginning with P, during the Industrial Revolution. So my point of departure then is a figure who appears all too infrequently in English Dante reception bibliography, but whose original and influential work embodies the kind of multifaceted translation that combined the realms of literature, historiography, moral philosophy and economics through the prism of late medieval Italian culture, and with it the voice of Dante, Jean-Charles Leonard Sismond de Sismondi, 1773-1842. To date, Sismondi has been cited mostly on account of his use by Byron and Shelley, his later enthusiastic adoption by Risorgimento writers, and medieval revivalists like Ruskin. Yet my sense is that Sismondi has been undervalued in terms of his significance as a cultural mediator who established a foundational frame of reference for British radicals and reformers engaged with the nascent discipline of political economy, while simultaneously mobilising medieval Italy and Dante. My aim today is to outline the main characteristics of this framework before considering briefly his importance to, on one hand, Thomas Carlyle, the so-called idiosyncratic radical and secular prophet, and secondly, his significance in the wider adoption, or his wider adoption, as a pre-Reformation reformer by British Protestant and Low Church laissez-faire clerical reformers. Born in the prosperous city-state of Geneva in 1773, the so-called Protestant Rome, his father was a Calvinist pastor and a member of the city's ruling tribune. Both his parents came from Protestant merchant families that fled France on account of the persecution after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Sismondi's life was characterised by a series of traumas and displacements that were a consequence of both his writings and the happenstance of his location. On the outbreak of the French Revolution, conditions in Geneva led his family to flee to England for 18 months, along with many Anglophile Genevans, before returning to his home city in 1794. The lack of improvement in conditions that he found on his return, and the sacking of the family home and his brief imprisonment together with his father, led the family to relocate to Italy in 1795, where they eventually purchased a small farmstead in Pescia, near Pistoia, in Tuscany in 1797. Here, the family reconnected with, the diaspora community of established Genevan exiles and friends, such as the Vieux in Florence, founders of the famous liberal Gabinetto. Sismondi was a ferocious reader, precocious intellect, and an avid writer. Driven from Tuscany on account of his seditious writings, he returned to Switzerland and frequented the so-called Coppet group, which met under the liberal patronage of Madame de Stael, accompanying her on her trip to Italy in 1804, that famously resulted in the publication Corinne ou l'Italie in 1807. So Sismondi's significance as reformer lies in the manner in which his writings on economics, literature and history all unite to the same end: the telling of the story of the progress of civilization, understood as the history of the conditions that rendered religious and civil liberty possible. His sociological and kind of encyclopedic analysis of past civilizations and historical moments, and his advocacy for the conditions which would lead to the advance of liberty and civilization in the present, involved him in the comparative analysis of constitutions and political regimes, in writing the social and political histories of diverse nations, in comparing multiple forms of agricultural and economic ordering, and writing against the institution of slavery and the iniquities of colonization. In addition, he has been claimed as a founding figure in the writing of national literary history on account of his study of the national literatures of Southern Europe. This was clearly influenced by Madame de Stael's 1800 de la littérature. So his engagement with political economy runs through these works as a kind of binding thread, if you like. As with many radicals, Voltaire's 1756 essay on universal history, The Manners and Spirit of Nations, was a conditioning text. Sismondi's critique of the institutional and the moral decay of Italy owes much to Robertson's History of the Reign of Charles V, and also to Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, volume 1 of which was published in the same year as The Wealth of Nations, 1776. Both of the last two texts he encountered during his exile in England, when he also first read Adam Smith, as part of his wider engagement with the moral philosophers, historians and economists of the Scottish Enlightenment, and especially Hume. Sismondi was immediately engaged by Smith's theory that the distribution of wealth was conditioned by what we now term sociological factors, rather than being divinely preordained, something which allowed space for the analysis of the role of human agency and institutional structures and practices in conditioning the fortunes of civilizations. The relation of the management of wealth of nations to the rise and fall of nations united history with economics, whilst the social and moral status of those nations was legible through their cultures. Sismondi became a passionate advocate of Smith's attack on the restrictive practices of government intervention, so-called mercantilism. Today is the day of the return of the mercantilist. That's another paper. And of the benefits of competition and free trade. Both Smith and in turn Sismondi saw liberty as more than simply freedom from oppression or foreign domination, what political theorists nowadays term negative liberty, because it was liberty in the fullest sense that enabled individual self-realization. Following in the footsteps of Smith, therefore, Sismondi saw economic prosperity as the result of competitive, rational self-interest within a correctly constituted polity and free market. A free market that would be characterized by trust and governed by the observation of legal contract. To quote Pape on Sismondi, history was the history of liberty, the achievement of representative government, and the rise of civilized middle classes, culminating in the rule of law. This was the subject matter of the history of the slow self-perfection of mankind. So read through this lens, the participatory mercantile city republics of late medieval Italy became precocious manifestations of the ideal form of social ordering for the well-being of all citizens. Sismondi saw the medieval communal value of libertas as a bulwark against both external threat by foreign despots and internal threat by native oligarchs intent on seizing control of the civic realm. That is the day. Hence, in part, also his antipathy towards the Medici, but that's another argument. He also saw them as the political form which best enabled the realization of this free self. In 1824, Brewster's Edinburgh Encyclopedia published an extensive essay entry entitled Political Economy that was actually written, originally in Italian, sometime after 1815, by Sismondi. The work is noteworthy for its startling diagnosis of a new social phenomenon which required a recalibration of Sismondi's free market capitalism as outlined in his earlier writings. For it admits to the emergence of a new social class. The change can be traced back to his travels through Europe post-1815, during which he was profoundly shocked by the ravages of a factory system which saw divorced labour from land and ownership, thereby creating an industrial, and the word is his, proletariat, okay? Literally offspring or proles for the factories of capitalist society. The word was subsequently obviously appropriated in turn by Marx. It starts with Sismondi. And this proletariat was living in misery. It was working long hours. Its wages were depressed by competition, and its very employment was threatened by increased mechanization. He was particularly agitated by the use of child labour. Sismondi was thus one of the earliest economists to speak of the existence of two social classes, a kind of trope that later in the 19th century becomes very widespread. His revised and more dynamic view of the necessity of state intervention was configured to contain the excesses of capitalism. For Sismondi, it became clear that the state must protect the poor given their precarious position. As one recent commentator has noted, it was not the equality of ranks that Sismondi advocated, but rather happiness in all ranks. A fundamental idea of civil society is the right of every man to improve his station in life. I've given you the first page of that encyclopedia entry there on the left. It's worth reading a bit in translation. The moral happiness of man, so far as it depends on his government, is intimately connected with the improvement of that government. It forms the object of civil policy, which ought to diffuse the happy influence of liberty, knowledge, virtue, and hope over all classes of the community. Civil policy should point out the means of giving to nations constitution, the liberty of which may elevate the souls of the citizens, an education which may form their hearts to virtue and open their mind to knowledge, a religion which may present to them the hopes of another life to compensate for the sufferings of this. It should seek not what suits one man or one class of men, but what may impart most happiness by imparting most worth to all the men living under its laws. I think it's unfair that Sismondi gets a mention in the Communist Manifesto as being petit bourgeois, but there is also an extent to which, in the kind of Marxist historiography, he's also seen as being the originator, the seeds, in a sense, of the kind of Marxist critique of political economy at the same time. You can see how that can work out from this starting position. In his encyclopedia entry and subsequent writing, Sismondi called, quote, for the intervention of the state to regulate the progress of wealth instead of reducing political economy to the simplest and apparently most liberal motto of laissez-faire and laissez-passer. Agreeing with Adam Smith's definition in The Wealth of Nations that political economy was an important division of the science of government, he denounced the orthodoxy of economists like Say, Ricardo, Malthus, and McCulloch, who overlooked Smith's moral writings and simply took his theory of free markets as a call to let every man do as he pleased and everything to take its course, what we might today term free market neoliberalism, kind of Milton Friedman version of Thatcherite, there's no such thing as society. The alignment of Sismondi's Genevan Calvinism with Smith's Scottish Presbyterian background is noteworthy. And in fact, Smith himself never used the term laissez-faire, with which he became so associated, believing that government did indeed have a crucial role in creating societal trust, which he regarded as essential for the workings of his dynamic view of the economy. As discussed in detail in his theory of moral sentiments in 1859, political association depended upon sympathy and trust as attributes of collective action and the workings of the market. Socialisation should inculcate a sense of duty to the civic norms as enshrined within a legal code. The social values required fuse the political virtues of civic humanism with Puritan advocacy of sobriety, equality, self-restraint, and industry, reflecting, as I say, his own Presbyterian upbringing. And it's in the observation of these laws and societal values that individuals could be trusted to police their own behaviour, and the policing function of government would thereby be reduced. In like manner, Sismondi stressed that, quote, the end of government is not to accumulate wealth in the state, but to make every citizen participate in the enjoyment of physical life which wealth represents. Sismondi's critique of the free market economics that emerged post-Smith was that the economists of his day were, quote, forgetting man for things. Participation, a share of sovereignty, and virtue defined as energy, moral strength, and noble passions were deemed resources of incalculable effectiveness for a polity. I mean, one could argue that Sismondi was in fact describing his own native Geneva prior to its spoliation by outside forces. Anyway, whatever the case, these were the ideas that originated in his 1803 De la Richesse Commerciale, his 16-volume History of the Italian Republics that he published between 1807 and 1818, and his 1813 Littérature du Midi de l'Europe. Predictably, Dante sits proudly within Sismondi's radical neo-medievalism. Although not cited in the economic writings, he appears in both the history of the Italian republics and the historical view of the literature of the south of Europe. We know that Sismondi owned his own Dante Commedia from his youth in Geneva, as witnessed in his 1794 library inventory, a 3-volume set in dodicesimo in Italian, published in Paris in 1787. The same text also appears in a list of books for transfer from the family home in preparation for the move to Tuscany. Sismondi's adaptation of Dante as radical reformer was clearly conditioned by his engagement with the work of Vittorio Alfieri, and especially Alfieri's 1786 Del Principe and delle Lettere, which appeared midway through what we can call the kind of late 18th century Dante revival, which saw some 16 editions appearing in print between 1776, it's a mythical date of Gibbon and Smith, and 1803, and a third of which actually were produced outside Italy. In his text, Alfieri attacks writers in the service of patrons and the neoclassical pursuit of aesthetics over social utility. That Italian word utilità is so fantastic because it has that sense of usefulness, but also kind of literally interest. The responsibility of the poet and the role of literature, according to Alfieri, was to simply remake the world. A brief fulfilled by only a few iconoclastic and sublime writers whose ferocity and truthfulness would ensure all rulers would seek to suppress their works. The threat of censorship of the true poet. Truth to power. Alfieri's Dante, in the words of one critic, quote, became a symbol of the literary life centered on the values of protest, endurance, and moral rectitude. In book 2, dedicated ai pochi literati che non si lasciano proteggere, Alfieri lists Hume, Milton, Homer, and Dante, with Dante taking the crown as the model poet hero, the ultimate libero scrittore, free writer. In the final 2 lines of a sonnet from 1783 addressed to Dante, Alfieri has Florentine poet Dante actually speak from his tomb and implore his interlocutor to action. He says, "Va, tuona, vinci, e se fra piedi vedi costoro, senza mirar, sovra essi passa." Okay? Go, roar, conquer. And should you stumble upon such people, walk over them without a glance. It's an incredibly powerful sonnet, which it kind of predates Shelley's Mask of Anarchy by some 36 years, but it's got the same kind of raw energy. Shelley's rise like lions after slumber in an unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few. It's in the same register as Shelley's Mask of Anarchy, which was his response to the Peterloo massacres of 1819. Okay. I think it's also interesting that, another discussion. But, Shelley's Mask of Anarchy was actually produced within 3 months of Byron's Prophecy of Dante, which he himself wrote in 1819, having visited Dante's tomb in Ravenna. So it's death, ghosts of the past. It was Alfieri's poet hero that graces the pages of Sismondi's historical view of the literature of the south of Europe, and in which Dante's Divine Comedy is described as, quote, the most sublime conception of the human intellect, in which the resurrection of the illustrious dead reveals the secrets of the invisible world. Quote, it stands alone as the first monument of modern genius, the first great work which appeared in the reviving literature of Europe. There's this really strong cosmopolitanism in the writings of the Scottish Enlightenment, but also in the sort of circles in Geneva at this period. And such work was only possible within the context of a social world in which poets fought against tyranny and despotism in defense of the right to self-determine and self-express to the end of securing the well-being and moral happiness of all citizens. Political economy as the public science of welfare. The moral of the lesson for current times was clear. Where liberty is lost, literary creativity declines in the long term and the progress of civilization is impeded. Dante stands as the perfect exemplification of the stated aim of Sismondi's historical review to show, quote, the reciprocal influence of the political and religious history of the people on their literature and of their literature on their character. The utility of literature in terms of character formation, which we'll come back to. And here I want to make a jump and make a further connection in terms of the genealogy of Dante's figuring at the intersection of poetry and political economy and reform. For it was only relatively recently, in the 1960s, that it was established that Sismondi's entry on political economy, which I've been discussing, was actually translated for the encyclopedia by Thomas Carlyle. Indeed, it was through this process of translation that Carlyle began to develop his social theory of modernity and his own, as I stated, influential idiosyncratic radicalism and critique of laissez-faire political economy as what he termed the dismal science. In his 1829 Sign of the Times, he famously decried the age of machines, as he called it, and called on poets to revive moral force and the dignity of soul and character that he saw as being destroyed by mechanisation. For Carlyle, the Industrial Revolution and the advent of the machine had finally conquered nature. He said, we war with nature, and by our restless engines, come off always victorious and loaded with spoils. But the question was, at what human cost do we amass these spoils? These themes were further treated in Chartism in 1840, as well as in Past and Present, famously in 1843, both of which texts were addressed to the so-called, as it was then, condition of England question. But obviously, Engels is then referencing in his Condition of the Working Class in England several years later. Carlyle says, why are the working classes discontented? What is their condition, economical, moral, in their houses and their hearts, as it is in reality, and as they figure it to themselves to be? What do they complain of? What ought they and ought they not to complain of? These are measurable questions. Now, it was via Sismondi that Carlyle derived the model of writing the literary history of national traditions as, quote, a comparative historical sociology of Europe and the civilizing process writ large. What was striking about Sismondi was that his championing of the Italian Middle Ages ran counter to the orthodox representation of Renaissance classicism, that they were both dark and barbaric, and that medieval poetry was crude. In this sense, he unified the Italian literary tradition with the emerging German historicism, which claimed that all nations and city-states had their own kinds of literature and culture. In the words of one secondary critic, Hogan, quote, Sismondi demonstrated to Carlyle the significance of the economy of literature in the civilizing process of Europe, and not least the specific importance of poetic periods of great literary creativity, such as the Middle Ages, when romantic literature did much to mollify the violence of barbarism by praising ideal worlds of love, chivalry, religion, charity, and valour. These indeed were the leitmotifs adopted by Carlyle in his own unfinished History of German Literature, which can almost be read as a companion piece to Sismondi's survey of the literature of Southern Europe. Sismondi taught Carlyle how to read the origins of modernity through the comparative history of national literatures. It was also via Sismondi that Carlyle came to appreciate the significance of the Italian medieval city republics as nurseries of liberty. It comes to no surprise, therefore, that as with Sismondi, Dante appears amidst Carlyle's essays on economics and comparative literature. For between Chartism and Past and Present, Carlyle wrote his On Heroes, Hero Worship and the Heroic in History in 1841, in which Dante appears in the company of Shakespeare in Lecture 3, The Hero as Poet. And it was here that Sismondi's Dante provided a template for Thomas Carlyle's portrait of Dante Poet, a portrait which is marked by what the editors of the Dante Critical Heritage volume describe as a stern Calvinistic moralism. I mean, it's actually strange in that book, that collation of extracts about Dante in terms of the critical heritage of his reception, that Madame de Stael and Schlegel both get a mention, but neither Sismondi or Sismondi's not there, which I think is sort of slightly strange. For Carlyle, it is strange. It is Dante, the poet and prophet, that embodies the Middle Ages. I quote: "Dante is the spokesman of the Middle Ages. The thought they lived by stands here in everlasting music. These sublime ideas of his, terrible and beautiful, are the fruits of Christian meditation of all the good men who had gone before him. Precious they, but also is not he precious? Much had not he spoken would have been done, not dead, yet living voiceless." I now want to make my sort of final third jump in terms of looking at Dante and dissent. And I understand dissent in the kind of religious sense of the term. And I think it's really worth bearing in mind the kind of Scottish Presbyterian influence, the Calvinism that we've been referring to, and the reception of Dante, in a sense, the conversion of Dante into a Protestant dissenting figure, his appropriation in that direction, which you want to look at now. And in a sense, I think I suppose I should retitle the paper kind of Dante and the Protestant work ethic. I mean, Weber was 1904. Sismondi's writing about these things in 1803. But yeah, we're from a sociological perspective, Weber definitely was onto something, but it's kind of even more rich in a sense than his work suggests. So by way of kind of concluding section, I want to briefly intimate, and this is a huge field, okay? So I did a paper on it a month ago in Leeds, and it's kind of another aspect of the whole study, but I think it's worth introducing here because it works. I want to briefly intimate how this configuration of Dante as reformer found such a wide reception with the evangelical movement, which itself emerged in conjunction with industrialization. For Dante the dissident, Dante the dissenter, was firmly placed in the pantheon of reformers before the Reformation. We've already seen how he's keeping company with Milton. And this was noted during the Reformation itself. His mention in Fox's Acts and Monuments, better known as the Book of Martyrs, served as an indication into the his induction into the anti-Catholic canon, securing his place in Protestant history and martyrology. In fact, the index of the 1641 edition of Fox's Acts and Monuments, looking at indexes again, reads Dante, an Italian writer against the Pope. It was the evangelical revival that reanimated this connection and folded Dante, together with Savonarola, and also in part Pastor, into its historiography of British Protestantism, which traced its roots back to Wycliffe and via the Reformation to the Puritanism of the 17th century. Also, the long-term British championing and protection of the Valdese in Piemonte, in the northwest of Italy, and also the British accommodation of the Huguenot exiles on the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, Sismondi's forbet. In this context, the hosting of successive exiled Italian free church reformers, the likes of Guicciardini, Ferretti, Rossetti, and revolutionary nationalists in Britain from the 1820s onwards, was the most recent chapter in the mission to convert and civilise Italy, which received a new momentum with the missionary energy of the evangelical revival, the unsuccessful, if you like, evangelical conversion of southern Europe to the Protestantism of northern Europe, which had taken place successfully, in inverted commas, at the time of Luther. Whilst the Italian emigres gave us Italian studies as a discipline, they also gave us a national librarian, Panizzi. British Protestants financed and sustained the missionary work of evangelizing Italy and countering the pernicious influence of Catholicism. I mean, Catholicism is seen here as, anti-liberty, anti-progress, anti-education, anti-modernity in that sense. So modernity becomes a Protestant Anglo-Saxon commodity to be exported to Italy as it sought to create itself as a modern nation. And here I've got some, this is actually a slide from the collection of the Plymouth Brethren in the Rhinelands Library, with pictures there of Guicciardini and a kind of vignette of the Valdesi being driven from their lands and making their pilgrimage across the hills to safety. But this spiritual awakening in modern Italy as part of a talk for fundraising that they gave as they toured around England. Okay. So it was that Thomas Macrae's 1827 Progress and Suppression of the Reformation in Italy in the 16th Century was translated into Italian and printed in Paris in 1835 for importation into Italian-speaking territories. So it's kind of British Protestantism that was actually authoring historiographical works to tell the Italians about the history of their own missed Reformation and chance to take it up again. Macrae is really, and again, Scottish Presbyterian, doing this work. At the same time, we've got this flood of organisations like the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, the British Foreign Bible Society, the Religious Tract Society, who in industrial numbers are exporting Protestant Bibles to Italy through mercantile channels. And John Rylance himself was extensively involved in that shipping of Protestant Bibles into Italy from the mid-19th century onwards. The role of Anglicans and Nonconformists was central in propagating the cult of Dante within what Boyd Hilton has described as the broader economy of redemption in the 19th century. Amongst early translators and commentators, Henry Carey was an Anglican vicar, alumnus of Christ Church, Oxford, Henry VIII's college, whose fellow Italophile friend Samuel Rogers also originally intended to become a Presbyterian minister. Similarly, Henry Boyd was a graduate of TCD, like several people here, another Reformation college. And Alison Milbank has shown the extent to which Carey's Dante translation was in particular is worked into Miltonic English blank verse in a form of Protestant domestication. So while such cultural appropriations and insertions of Dante into British Protestant historiography and Anglo-Saxon Dante studies became commonplace, I'm interested in the exchange that takes place, what the British tradition exports to Italy, whilst looking at this issue of who Dante keeps company with at this period. And the English pilgrim that was exported to Italy as the embodiment of the evangelical revival was John Bunyan. Il Pellegrinaggio del Cristiano, translated by Stanislav Bianchiardi, was first published in Genova in 1855 and then by the Claudiana Press in Florence in 1863 onwards. And I'm not exaggerating when I say it literally goes through multiple editions well into the 20th century, and that thousands of copies were printed for distribution, as well as illustrated story cards that you could buy as packs. They were published both in Turin, Florence, and in Britain for export. Albeit Bunyan, unlike Milton, had no recourse to Dante in composing his works, the two pilgrims shared an identical road. The two pilgrims shared an identical road in terms of evangelical purpose. Both narrated journeys which required constant moral vigilance, the overcoming of fears and temptation, moral choice and perseverance. It is no surprise that some commentators almost conflated the two texts. Amelia Gurney's 1893 Dante's Pilgrim Progress. The illustration of this sort of overlay, if you like. Bunyan, and following in his footsteps, Dante, were ideal authors to carry the Victorian mantra of self-improvement. There is that sort of limited laissez-faire notion of self-improvement. It really taps into the work of writers like Samuel Smiles and his book Self-Help. But then he also wrote books called Duty It's this Victorian Protestant self-help ethos, which is economical in both a financial sense, but also in a kind of moral, in a moral sense. The place of Dante within evangelical philanthropy requires further positioning, is something I'm working on. But he was clearly a figure that spoke to the middle-class moralists' educational agenda via the multiple charitable organisations that were established to do good works and to save fellow men from the temptations and the sins of the world. And this constituency to whom they ministered, of course, was the new industrial proletariat identified by Milner. The ability of the individual to maximise his or her personal capital was a letter for all ages, and lies at the root, as I said, of the Victorian self-help movement, with its emphasis on all the civic virtues articulated by Smith and Sismondi: self-control, perseverance, work, industry, duty, and frugality. This sense of moral duty saw evangelism at the heart of philanthropy, as the rich were encouraged to save and be frugal, but also to give. In the words of Wesley himself, save all you can, but lest frugality become avarice, give all you can. So the placing of Dante within the framework described by Weber as the Protestant work ethic may seem a kind of strange point of arrival or terminating this talk. But returning to our point of departure in Manchester, this is a religious tract society text. Right? These are texts that were published in their thousands for distribution in Sunday schools to children. Okay, and if you buy any online, vast majority of them come with little dedicatory book plates from telling you which Wesleyan Sunday school they've actually been. But Capital for Working Boys for the Religious Tract Society. Absolutely fantastic material. Returning to our point of departure in Manchester, and I want to end up giving you this picture of my home library, and Dante figured in the stained glass window in the historic reading room. Because it was precisely this dynamic, it was this philanthropic, educational, non-conformist home missionary zeal, which actually led Mrs. Rylance to build the library, to dedicate it to the citizens of Manchester for the education of the people of the city, but also which led to the creation, and that's another paper, of one of the most important Dante collections that we have in the world outside Italy itself, over 6,500 Dante volumes. Mrs. Rylance actually purchased, again in terms of capital, the Dante collection of the librarian of the Biblioteca Laurentiana in 1906, and had it imported from Florence via London to Old Trafford. So again, we finish where we started. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was a wonderful lecture. This wonderful whistle-stop tour through the 18th and 19th centuries, looking at these Dante encounters. I'm just going to stop sharing. Yep. Okay, we have time now for plenty of questions from the room. If you are going to ask a question from the room, I would ask you to come up to the microphone. So, George, I'm sorry, it's just for the people at home so they can actually hear as well. Okay. And if you are shy and you prefer to put the question in the chat, please do so. George.
Can I do it from here?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's come up here. Thank you. That was absolutely absorbing. I just wanted to ask a quick question about how whether you would coming from the other end of the pole, because you're kind of focusing on Dante in the 19th century. Do you ever have sort of time to go back and think about the political economy in which Dante was writing? So, because also this is a huge point of transition in medieval Italy from feudalism into mercantilism. And I think too of the end of in Inferno 34 of the Machulla to which Satan is compared, i.e. a machine that is made to chop vegetables or thresh grain. This is a fear. This is, to me, a kind of exactly a prefiguration. So, do you have in your research? Do you take time?
Yeah, I
to
don't.
Think about
I don't do that. I don't do that. I haven't yet, anyway, done that textual work, which I feel is kind of almost another departure, even though it can be indicated, and I can draw on the extensive secondary bibliography on every canto of Dante's Divine Comedy. And I have friends who've worked on the kind of economic history of late medieval Florence, particularly in relation to kind of banking. There's quite a lot of work being done relatively recently, precisely not only on the Medici family, but on late medieval communal Italy and the origins of capitalism, and kind of framing it within kind of business history context. There's somebody at the University of York who's written a couple of really good articles specifically on that subject. I mean, I think, so the answer is no, but I know it's there. And I think if you push at it, those parallels are there, and it'd be very interesting to see whether those parallels are actually being noted. What I think is interesting is that when Sismondi and other writers who are considering aspects of late medieval and Renaissance Italy and the city-states in particular, republics, are in discussion, it's very interesting the extent to which, from a 19th century point of view, the comments that they have to make about things like the Pazzi conspiracy, about the rise of the Ciompi, and what fascinates me, in a sense, and I didn't have time to put it in here, but it's a complete other discussion, but it's absolutely centrally embedded in this, is the dialogue. I don't want to call it controversy because they did keep saying that they were friends, but it's quite an acrimonious exchange between William Roscoe in Liverpool and Sismondi over the status of the Medici, which is a kind of a great area of contestation. So, I mean, you could almost run a kind of an analysis of the contestation of the Medici in the 19th century alongside a kind of analysis of the utilization of Dante as well. Because for Sismondi, of course, the Medici represented a kind of corrupting oligarchy who had effectively deprived the primo popolo of their libertas, in a sense. Whereas for Roscoe, he very much saw them as the kind of merchant princes of their day that embodied the values of kind of mercantile Liverpool. And you know, Roscoe himself was a collector, a very keen collector. He had 3 Dante incunables and 20 Cinquecentas that were in his sale when his library was auctioned in 1816. So, you know, Roscoe is engaging with Dante, he's engaging with late medieval and Renaissance Italy in exactly the same way as Sismondi, and they have a large-scale kind of argument, and Roscoe actually publishes a book to counter the criticisms of his adoption of Lorenzo rather than Dante as the kind of quintessential Renaissance proto-mercantile Republican sort of enlightened citizen, if you like. And from that point of view, I think it's really interesting that Gibbon, before he wrote Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, had a choice to make in his own mind, and the choice that he was, and it's in his correspondence, he was thinking of writing history of the Medici. Now, if Gibbon had written the Rise and Fall of the Medici rather than the Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, the likelihood is that Sismondi, or I don't know, I think the likelihood is that this is counterfactual, of course. The likelihood is that Roscoe wouldn't have written his history of Lorenzo de' Medici because it kind of would already be covered by Gibbon. But it's interesting that those two are operating within that kind of same nexus. And in fact, that it was Roscoe's son, Thomas Roscoe, the translator, who not only translated Sismondi's survey of the literature of Southern Europe, but also, and I can't find this actually listed in any of the catalogues, was the translator several years later of Sismondi's writings on political economy. So there's there wasn't time here, but there is another chapter section which I will do, which is on this kind of contestation of the kind of Medici in terms of their mercantile pedigree. And that then extends to looking at Mrs. Rylance as a collector of Danteana, if you like, because in 1919, the Rylance Library went to auction in London and purchased the last set of Medici papers that came onto the market. So there's a Medici collection at the John Rylance as well. One half went to Manchester, and the other half was purchased by the half that they'd hoped to buy actually was purchased by another gentleman who outbid them, who was George Selfridge, because he was writing his book, The Romance of Trade. And Selfridge gave his Medici collection to Harvard, the Harvard Business School, and that collection has really been worked on in detail, and is actually the collection out of which the 2 articles by the guy in New York have come in terms of looking at late medieval Renaissance Italy as the origins of capitalism through those notebooks. So, I'll give you his name afterwards. He used to be at Cornell, did a PhD with John and Jane.
Are there questions in the room or questions from our audience? It's very hard for me to see. Can you see, Chiara? Are there questions from the audience online?
Yeah, there is a comment by Julia.
Okay, I can read out this comment. If I can start it here. What does she say? Absolutely agree with this lecture as custodian of Florence de Swisso's so-called English cemetery of Victorian expats. Some mill owners, prisoners, because they were smuggling Bibles into Tuscany. Dante scholars, abolitionists, pre-Raphaelites, etc. have done. Okay, and she's just published Florence's English Cemetery, which Cambridge Scholars Press. Yes, Julia, who's a great supporter of this particular series, some tremendous work on this particular aspect in Tuscany. Are there questions here in the room? I am just, as people are kind of formulating their thoughts, because I realize that, Steve has kind of, I should point out, actually, before I say what I'm about to say, that Steve earlier on today told me that you do realize today that the 20th of January is the most depressing day of the year. It's officially that, and there's a lot to be depressed about today. Having said that, though, there was so much in this lecture that I actually completely forgot about, or was in any way, shape or form depressed by anything he said. But I found it fascinating, just bringing it back to Dante, if I may, because as you know, we did an issue of Bibliotheca Dantesca last year, looking at the role of Dante commemorations and looking how they kind of function across different nations and different times. And this whole British 19th century industrial, post-industrial, Victorian Dante, something by the time we get into the 20th century is very much an established thing. The Dante studies in Britain, in England in particular, as a discipline within Italian studies, is one of the leading ones that there is, and yet it is very much, and there is no kind of real tension with the Dante that moves into the 20th century. It's accepted and subsumed into a culture, almost as if he were one of their own. And it is funny then when you get into the kind of post-colonial realm and you bring it to Ireland, whereas the Irish were trying to set about articulating their own Irishness, they proffered instead a very Catholic Dante as a way, not so much of kind of this is what Dante was, but as a way of kind of demonstrating their separateness from the British model. And that particular, so they went down with Dante, the road of Dante the Franciscan, and looking at Dante in almost exclusively Catholic terms to distance themselves from the British model. And has the British relationship with Dante changed over time?
I think you're absolutely right, and the writing of the kind of continuity of the Catholic Dante, or the Dante of resistance to the kind of Protestant 19th century model, is really thought-provoking. One of the things that happened in the Rylance on the purchase of the Dante collection was that some of the greater good of the city established a Manchester Dante Society in 1906, which ran and continued into existence into the 1990s, and still as a kind of iteration through the Manchester branch of the Società Dante Alighieri. And the founder, or the first kind of president of that, was the Roman Catholic, second generation Italian Roman Catholic Bishop of Salford, who was actually trained and went to a Catholic seminary near Durham, Bolshaw Hall. And his letters home to his father are fascinating. And he actually, I didn't put it in the talk, but he actually says that they're starting to study history. Thank God that we're not looking at that Protestant rubbish like Sismondi. So, as he's training within the kind of curriculum and studying of Dante, which is a lifelong interest of his, yeah, there's definitely a sense of that there are people to read on Dante, and kind of following slavishly in the footsteps of the English kind of Protestant model. There was an alternative route, but I would be very interested to find out more. I mean, I think it's linked also to the potentially linked to, because he wrote an article on Dante and the popes, which I think will be very interesting to see in terms of the kind of Pope bashing of the 19th century Protestantism. Of actually, what was it that Casabelli was saying? Was he seeking to kind of redeem them in some shape or form in the eyes of his audience and his speakers in early 20th century Manchester? So yeah, there is. I think that tradition is there, but I would like to know more about it. I mean, on the subject of cemeteries that have been brought up, yeah, I mean you got the Cimitero E Cattolico, the Protestant cemetery in Rome, and there's another one in Livorno. But these places of kind of commemoration of non-conformity are incredibly rich kind of sites, and you know, Julia's done sterling work, and hopefully when I go back to France, I can see her again and go for a renewed visit. But it is, as you say, that is the model that rolls unproblematically, majoritarily across the kind of Anglo-Saxon world. And after all, the sponsorship of Dante studies in North America is predominantly through the mediation of the Unitarians. It's Charles Eliot Norton. That's the constituency, and they were in direct connection. Charles Eliot Norton spent much time in Rome, and he spent time in Rome in the company of Elizabeth Gaskell, who also studied Dante. So there's another kind of Mancunian Dante iteration through the writings of Mrs. Gaskell, whose father also wrote entries to Brew's Encyclopedia, Edinburgh Encyclopedia, which Carlyle's translation gives it. So that genealogy is running through that as well. But yeah, anybody who's an expert on 19th century Catholic narratives outside Italy of Dante, I'd be interested to know more about those.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions before we let Steve off the hook? No, he's given us a lot this evening. Okay. Oh, we have one more. Master, you've got to come up and speak into the microphone, I'm afraid. So we would like to have a roving microphone in the room. It would make life a lot easier, but yeah, a bit of exercise does no one any harm.
Thank you so much. I thought it was a really interesting lecture. Dante is not my specialty, so I enjoyed it even more because I had to learn a lot while you were talking. But I found it really beautiful this way you speak about mobilizing Dante, so using Dante in the present. And you sketch a fantastic and super clear picture of how this happened in the 19th century. And the way you started talking about it, this time of change and social injustices and so on, I think it very much relates to this idea that the 20th of January right now is a very depressing time, because obviously we're facing such a time of change and justice. And you speak about Dante's ghost, so this reference to ontology, and this idea that ghosts like Dante come back to be mobilized and be alive in the present to help us with something. So my first question would be, is Dante being mobilized in this way right now? Do you see that happening or not? And if not, could it have anything to do with the time frame that we are studying, the long 19th century, and this political economy being built upon a racialized structure, so the racial structure of the political economy of 19th century? What did it afford in using Dante as the model of the radical and the dissenter in relation to race? Is it affording it to us today? Is it stopping us from using Dante in this way?
Thank you. Well, that's an incredibly good question and very, very rich. I'm sort of tempted to pass over to Serena Bandy, who's online, who gave a paper precisely on this at the Society for Italian Studies conference at Royal Holloway last summer, looking at the kind of contemporary mobilisations of Dante, both in the kind of far-right movement in Italy, where he's been accommodated, because, you know, of course, it's Dante, so he gets appropriated by the fascists as well. It's going to happen. It's something and yeah, so that there are people working on the kind of contemporary mobilisation, as you put it. But yeah, today seems like another great day to inject some energy back into radical Dante in terms of critiques of the ability to maintain free speech, the danger of oligarchs, and yeah, kind of protecting the well-being of liberty. The discourse about race is fascinating. It's inevitably complex. It's to do with the kind of the ambiguity, if you like, of the non-conformist relationship to slavery in terms of their championing. I'm trying to think about So there's and it's really interesting to see how the choreography, if you like, involvement in the uprising, demonstration, but also the kind of ambivalence in use the product of that strategy. One area that has interested me, kind of reading more into the 19th century, particularly in relation to Chartism and the campaign for universal suffrage contemplated by the Chartists, is the extent to which they describe factory workers as white slaves. And the tension, if you like, to say we have to, protectionist degree, we have to look after our own slaves and sort that out in the factory before we start writing about manifestations of slavery. And that's quite a common motif within Chartist radical circles in relation to how that plays with Dante probably requires a kind of, again, it's going back, as you suggested, to Dante's own writing and then trying to excavate or interrogate a kind of 19th century commentary tradition and see whether that is what they tease out. My sense is with the ones that I've looked at is that they're more exercised by how do you square the notion of poetry when poetry is the reality of poetry. They're almost kind of theological issues of that type, which Dante throws up that they feel need addressing, rather than kind of sociological issues around race and liberty. They're not using Dante to do that work at that stage, which is an interesting silence in its own right. Yeah? But yeah, very good question, and it is something that I'm sort of thinking through. I'm reading that.
Thank you. And in the context of today, there's plenty going on in the so-called Global South, and especially the Caribbean Institute, which I think is a hugely important presence and has been an inspiration for countless artists. And many Dante scholars who have begun to embrace this aspect of the legacy. Of course, most famously, as well as Dante himself, didn't really fully appreciate or understand the age in which he himself was living. And if you look at his notions of what was the dead animal, the influx of people into his own native Florence in the early 1700s, he was quite conservative because he didn't understand the kind of economic forces that were at play. That would have been there for the betterment of the people within the city limits and people that were coming in within the city. That is another lecture. Okay, so just to remind you that as coming to the first lecture, you have inadvertently signed up to come to all 5 lectures, and I'm afraid if any of you are missing next week, there will be a search party looking for you. So this is lecture 1, and we go over 5 weeks. We have 1 break for the bank holiday here on the 1st of February that week there, and then we resume. One of the lectures, the 3rd lecture, I believe it is, with Guy Tomazzoli, will take place in the CAC seminar room, because this room is not available, but all other lectures will take place here in the CAS room. So we have a young, up-and-coming scholar next week, Professor Zygmunt Baranski, who, to many of you who have read, were involved in Italian studies, will know that Zig is one of the foremost voices in Dante studies, and he has been for quite some considerable amount of time. And we're delighted to have Zig over. He's talked before in the series, but online during COVID. And the title of his lecture next week is La forma universale di questo nodo, which is a quotation from Canto di Paradiso, verse 91, the structures of Dante's afterlife. And if any of you have ever heard Zig talk before, it is something that shouldn't be subdued. Tell your friends, your cousins, and your neighbours. So it just leaves me to say thank you to Steve for what quite a brilliant opening to our lecture series. We look at Dante in the round in these series, and the British 19th century is one of those fantastic areas. And it really was a tour de force. Thank you, Steve. I'm going to stop the recording.